The night in Tanzania no longer feels like peace. It feels like pressure. From Dar es Salaam to Arusha, the air smells of burnt plastic and the silence between gunshots is heavier than the sound itself. The government calls it an election day. But to the people, it looks more like a funeral for democracy. Earlier this morning, the streets filled with young Tanzanians waving handwritten signs, "No freedom without truth. Stop the fake election and let the people speak." But as their voices grew louder, the screens went dark. Internet connections failed one by one. And within hours, Tanzania, a nation once praised for its calm, was suddenly cut off from the world. At the center of it all stands President Samia Suluhu Hassan, accused of running an election without opponents after banning the two largest opposition parties and arresting their leaders. She now faces the people unarmed, unafraid, and unstoppable. The question echoing through every blocked signal and silenced broadcast is this: when a president runs against herself, can we still call it democracy? What's happening in Tanzania today is more than a political crisis. It's a test of truth, the kind that decides whether a nation bends or breaks. The soldiers on the streets may hold the weapons, but it is the youth holding the future. As smoke rises from polling stations and the nation's voice is buried beneath censorship, the world must ask itself, if democracy dies quietly in Tanzania tonight, who will hear its last breath? Stay with us as we uncover the hidden reality behind Tanzania's 2025 election, the arrests, the protests, and the resistance that no blackout can silence. If you believe Africa deserves leaders who serve the people, not themselves, share this story. Subscribe if you believe the truth should never be switched off, even when the internet is. October 29th, 2025, the day Tanzania was supposed to vote. But before sunrise, armored vehicles were already rolling through the streets of Dar es Salaam. The rumble of the Tanzania People's Defense Forces echoed through neighborhoods where polling stations were meant to open. What should have been a celebration of democracy began instead as a show of force. Inside homes, families whispered. Radios played nothing but the national anthem on repeat. On TV, government anchors smiled stiffly, announcing that voting has begun peacefully across the nation. But outside, the truth was different. Thousands of young people, the children of farmers, teachers, and small traders, poured into the streets chanting in Swahili, haki haki kwa watu, justice, justice for the people. They were not armed. They carried placards, phones, and faith. But the government saw them as enemies. The cause of the unrest was clear. President Samia Suluhu Hassan had declared herself the only legitimate candidate after banning the country's two main opposition parties, Chadema and Act Wazalendo. Their leaders, Tundu Lissu and John Heche, were arrested months before Election Day, accused of inciting unrest. In truth, they had simply called for transparency and reform. In Tarima, Heche's stronghold polling centers stood empty. Angry citizens refused to vote, burning the wooden booths that once symbolized their right to choose. "We will not participate in lies," shouted one man before the flames engulfed the ballot boxes. The arrests of opposition figures weren't isolated events. They were part of a broader strategy to silence dissent. Civil society organizations were shut down. Journalists were detained for asking the wrong questions. And as international observers tried to enter the country, border patrols were ordered to turn them away. Then came the final blow: internet blackout. For many Tanzanians, it was the moment they realized how fragile their freedom truly was. X, formerly Twitter, Facebook, and WhatsApp went offline. News from Dar es Salaam stopped flowing. Yet somehow short videos and live clips still slipped through, filmed by trembling hands, uploaded through VPNs. The world saw flashes of chaos, crowds confronting riot police, tear gas over stadiums, and chants demanding that the president step down. And in the midst of this chaos, the army's role became uncertain. Some soldiers marched alongside the police, others simply stood and watched. Then something unexpected happened. Protesters began cheering for the army. "They are our brothers," shouted one young woman into a camera before being dragged away. "We want them to defend the nation, not the politicians." That moment captured something powerful. The people's hope that the military, often seen as an arm of oppression, might now become their shield. Meanwhile, President Suluhu cast her vote in a heavily guarded polling station, cameras clicking as she smiled and waved. Her image was broadcast across national TV, a picture of calm, as if the country outside those walls wasn't burning. By evening, fires were reported in more than 10 cities. Polling stations were reduced to ash. And in homes without internet or electricity, parents prayed their children would come back from the protests alive. This wasn't just an election gone wrong. It was the collapse of an illusion, the realization that democracy in Tanzania had become a performance carefully scripted, tightly controlled, and tragically believable. For the youth, this day marked the end of patience. For the regime, it marked the beginning of fear. As the day stretched into a choking dusk, the streets of Tanzania became a war zone not of bombs, but of belief. The sound of chanting youth collided with the clatter of boots, and the smell of smoke hung like a shadow over the capital. The government had called for calm. Instead, it got defiance. In Mwanza, hundreds of young men and women flooded the central square, waving the Tanzanian flag upside down, a silent symbol of distress. Police trucks rolled in, sirens screamed. Tear gas cut through the air, but the people refused to move. "We have nothing left to fear," one young man shouted before a blast sent him sprawling to the ground. He rose again, coughing, eyes burning, still holding the flag. Across the country, the same scene repeated itself in Arusha, Dodoma, Tarime, Mbeya. The nation had become a patchwork of courage and chaos. And then came the moment no one expected. The Tanzania People's Defense Forces (TPDF) began moving not just near the protests, but into them. Tanks turned their cannons away from the crowds, forming barriers between the police and the people. Soldiers stood silently as protesters cheered. A camera captured one soldier whispering to a young protester, "Go home, brother. Tonight will be long." It was the first sign of fracture inside the state's machinery, the people's cry reaching the conscience of the uniform. The spark that lit this moment came from one name, Captain Tessa. Weeks before the election, this mid-ranking officer publicly criticized the government's crackdown, invoking the spirit of Julius Nyerere, the founding father of the nation. He said, "We are soldiers of the people, not the servants of fear." For that he was arrested, but his words did not die with him. They spread like wildfire through the barracks. Now, in 2025, his defiance lived on in the eyes of every young soldier, ordered to aim his gun at his own countrymen. While the state media aired images of calm polling stations and smiling officials, the real Tanzania unfolded on the streets, unfiltered, furious, alive. Protesters recorded the tanks rolling past chanting "TPDF with us," and the People's Army in Tarime, where the arrest of opposition leader John Heche had sparked outrage. The youth set up barricades of burning tires, blocking government convoys. They shouted his name into the smoke, "Heche, Heche, freedom." The regime responded with a heavy hand. Police fired live rounds into the air and at times into the crowd. Hospitals overflowed. Ambulances were stopped at checkpoints. Still, new protesters came, barefoot, hungry, determined. A few foreign journalists who managed to smuggle footage out of the country described a generation that refused to kneel. By midnight, the internet blackout was total. But Tanzania's silence became its loudest message. Clips shot hours earlier had already reached Nairobi, Kampala, and even Washington. Global hashtags began appearing: "Yain stand with Tanzania," "Yuanas let them vote," "Yodas internet is a democracy." And yet, as the world began to watch, the government doubled down. Presidential guards surrounded state buildings. Orders were given to secure communication zones. The last independent radio station, Upendo FM, went off-air after police stormed its studio. Still, hope flickered. Across Dar es Salaam, candles appeared on balconies one after another, forming a constellation of resistance across the city's dark skyline. An elderly man, once a teacher under Nyerere, was interviewed before the signal cut. His final words, shaky but clear, summed up the nation's heartbeat: "We taught our children peace." But if peace becomes obedience, what will they learn from our silence? That night, Tanzania stood at the edge of transformation, a nation split between fear and freedom, a president surrounded by power but stripped of legitimacy, and a generation that refused to surrender its voice even when the world could no longer hear it. By dawn, the smoke had settled, but the silence that followed was worse than the chaos itself. Tanzania woke up to broken glass, empty streets, and a heavy feeling that something sacred had been lost overnight. In Dar es Salaam, mothers wandered from hospital to hospital searching for their children. Some found them bruised, others never came back. Outside Muhimbili National Hospital, a small crowd gathered to read the handwritten list of names posted on the wall, a list that grew longer each hour. There were no official reports, no press conferences, no condolences, only silence. The government called it a return to order. But order built on fear is just another form of collapse. Across the country, civil life began to fracture. Shops remained closed. Taxi drivers refused to work after seeing soldiers patrolling the highways. Teachers dismissed their classes early, telling students, "Stay home until the country finds its voice again." Even the church bells in Arusha rang differently that morning, slower, mournful, uncertain. Behind closed doors, the political elite scrambled. Some members of the ruling party whispered about forming a transitional council. Others warned President Samia Suluhu that the unrest could spread into the army itself. For the first time in her presidency, her authority no longer seemed absolute. Inside government buildings, advisors debated whether to postpone the elections or declare them completed by national consensus. But the truth was clear: there was no consensus left. The country was split between those clinging to power and those demanding a future. Meanwhile, the families of detained opposition figures, including Tundu Lissu and John Heche, began organizing vigils. Thousands joined in silent prayer, holding candles in the shape of the Tanzanian flag. What began as mourning slowly turned into a movement. The protests had taken lives, but they had also reborn something deeper: the idea that a nation's dignity cannot be imprisoned. A statement released anonymously by soldiers sympathetic to the youth circulated through encrypted channels. "The people are not the enemy. We swore an oath to protect Tanzania, not a throne." It was the first clear sign of rebellion from within. The image of Captain Tisa re-emerged as a symbol of conscience, his words replayed across hidden radios. "We are soldiers of the people, not the servants of fear." At the same time, the economic fallout began to bite. Tourism collapsed, the shilling dropped overnight, and Western investors quietly withdrew. Yet, for many citizens, the greater loss wasn't financial, it was emotional. The belief that their vote mattered had been shattered. In a modest home in Dodoma, a retired schoolteacher looked at her grandchildren and said softly, "We built this nation with honesty, but now our leaders build it on fear." That sentence became the unofficial summary of the crisis, a nation once hailed for stability, now trembling under its own weight. Still amid the ruins, something new began to form: networks of citizens, lawyers, journalists, and clergy organizing a people's petition for freedom. They didn't call for revolution. They called for redemption, a return to truth, transparency, and the forgotten promise of Nyerere's legacy. A leader is a servant, not a ruler. Tanzania's political system might survive this crisis on paper, but in the hearts of its people, something irreversible had already changed. The illusion had fallen, and once the people have seen the truth, no blackout can make them unsee it. When the internet went dark in Tanzania, the silence echoed far beyond Africa. In Washington, D.C., analysts at the State Department watched grainy satellite images showing smoke rising from Dar es Salaam, but official statements were slow and cautious. The United States called for restraint, the same word it had used in Kenya, Sudan, and Ethiopia before. To many Africans, it sounded less like concern and more like indifference. American networks gave the story a few seconds of airtime, framing it as another election dispute in Africa. But those who have lived long enough know words like that are how injustice hides in plain sight. In Paris and Brussels, diplomats expressed deep worry while continuing trade talks with the same Tanzanian government accused of crushing dissent. Meanwhile, in Nairobi, activists and journalists gathered at Uhuru Park holding signs that read, "We see you, Tanzania." A similar vigil appeared in Kampala and Kigali, where young people recorded videos of solidarity whispering through fear. But perhaps the most powerful reaction didn't come from any government. It came from ordinary people across the African continent who recognized themselves in the faces of Tanzanian youth. From Accra to Lagos, hashtags like Nadirs Stand With Tanzania and Moi Let Them Vote spread faster than fire. Africans were no longer watching Tanzania as a foreign tragedy. They saw it as a mirror. At the same time, foreign policy experts in the U.S. began drawing uncomfortable comparisons. One headline in The Atlantic asked, "If democracy collapses quietly in Africa, will Washington even notice?" For decades, America's influence in East Africa had rested on partnerships built during the Cold War: stability over freedom, control over conscience. Tanzania, long seen as a quiet ally, was rarely criticized, but now that quiet had become complicity. Within think tanks and congressional briefings, some voices began to question this silence. "We can't keep applauding elections we know are fake," said one senior researcher from the Council on Foreign Relations. "Because every time we do, we lose credibility, not just in Africa, but everywhere democracy is bleeding." Across the ocean, another story was being told, one that gave hope. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré spoke of a new kind of leadership, one rooted in dignity and truth. His words began to resonate with Africans disillusioned by hollow democracies and foreign scripts. Tanzania's youth began quoting him online. Sovereignty begins when fear ends. For older Americans watching this unfold, it may feel familiar. The civil rights marches of the 1960s, the protests for voting rights, the long struggle between power and people. The faces have changed, but the questions remain the same. Who controls truth? Who gets to decide what freedom means? In a world that often looks away when Africa bleeds, the courage of Tanzanian youth has reminded us all democracy doesn't die in darkness. It dies when good people stop paying attention. And perhaps that's the real test for the world today. Will we just watch Tanzania fade into silence, or will we finally listen before it's too late? As dawn broke over Tanzania, the smoke began to fade, but the silence remained. Streets once filled with chants of hope now echo with a quieter, heavier sound, the weight of unanswered questions. No one knows how many were arrested, how many disappeared, or how many chose exile over fear. But one truth stands above all: the youth of Tanzania have crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. They have looked power in the eye and refused to bow. And in that refusal, they have given the rest of Africa a mirror. The story of Tanzania is no longer just about one election. It is about a generation demanding honesty in a continent tired of deception. It is about the young men and women who believe that democracy is not a ceremony, but a covenant. But there is danger too. For every movement that rises, there are hands ready to crush it with weapons, with money, with silence. And that silence is the most dangerous of all. Because when the world grows used to ignoring Africa's pain, injustice learns to hide behind diplomacy. Across the continent, from Burkina Faso to Niger, from Ghana to Kenya, people are watching. They are asking the same question the Tanzanian youth asked before they stepped into the streets. If we don't stand now, when will we? Even in the heart of the Sahel, President Ibrahim Traoré has reminded his people that freedom is not a gift, but a daily choice. His voice, echoed across Africa, now meets the cries of Tanzanian students, farmers, and mothers who want nothing more than to be heard. And maybe that is where the new Africa begins, not in palaces or summits, but in the courage of ordinary people who dare to say no to lies and yes to dignity. To the world watching, especially those of us far away in the comfort of peace, Tanzania's struggle is not foreign. It is a reminder that every nation, no matter how stable, stands one silence away from losing its soul. So tonight, as you watch this, ask yourself, do we still believe in truth, even when it comes from the poorest? Do we still believe in democracy, even when it's inconvenient? And do we still have the courage to listen before the lights go out again? If you believe that Africa deserves to choose its own path, share this story. If you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's vision of sovereignty and dignity should not stand alone, let your voice be part of it. And if you believe that truth is more powerful than censorship, subscribe and help keep the light alive when others turn it off.